the idea of like roles in the game, or another concept I've actually tried to invent and make terminology the last few years, is not just roles, but like role balance. So for example, if you have like a really good, like hard entry aggressive player, then you probably want some sort of like cold zero type motherfucker to come and clean up at the end of the round. Like you know from your teams, mate. I mean, the reason I bring this up is you were one of the first IGLs I'm aware who actually even understood this concept, because again, funnily enough, the necessity is the mother of invention, right? You didn't want to, Lurpers. You wanted just to have a bunch of good players who would listen to you and do what was necessary. But instead, what you ended up with was the two best players in your team who could not be cut, not least because they refused to cut themselves. One of them was like, I go forwards all the time. And then the other one was like, I play with shift, which is my walk key, permanently on. So you had the two most extreme ends of and by the way, there wasn't even like, we didn't even really use the term lurker back then or entry. Like, these motherfuckers just only wanted to play these two ridiculous styles. So as a result, if you have those players, you're going to start to basically build out a team that makes sense, right? You're going to have someone who works in between, and the AWPer's going to play like you get this concept, right? So where do you come down on this? The idea of roles or whatever. Like, obviously, I'm not saying, as people try to make it, like you have to have set roles, like people think in basketball you have to have those 5 roles. Like almost no team does, by the way. I don't know why people keep saying that. Like, in the modern day, there's almost no centers. Like, there's about 1 billion fucking stretch fours, and everyone shoots 3-pointers. So it's like that. I don't know why everyone's pretending like basketball's a hard and fast rule. No, it's just a way of like modeling the game. So where do you come down on the idea of roles in Counter, at least CSGO?
I mean, to some extent, I think you end up having roles even if it's not intentional, if you play together for long enough. Now, like, they may vary more and more, but I think sort of naturally, if you keep playing, and I think everybody would notice this even just playing with their friends over and over and over again, like you kind of end up doing the same things because it's just an easier way of practicing, easier way of getting more reps and, improving quicker. So I think you naturally end up there regardless. I think that's the number one reason that I remain very skeptical of 6-man rosters in Counter-Strike. I just think the continuation that you get from having the same people doing the same things over and over and over again is what effectively allows you to become better than the sum of effectively allows the team to become better than the sum of its parts over time. And I think if you keep constantly meddling and changing things, I don't think you can get there. I do agree that at least like in the earlier years of Counter-Strike when I was playing, so like call it like 2005 to 2008 or something, I don't think people generally speaking thought of there being many different roles. So you'd have someone who usually ops, though that wasn't even necessarily the case in my team. It's just sort of whoever,
yes.
Just because of the personnel that we had. You normally had somebody who tended to be the first person in, but that wasn't necessarily like a talking thing. I think that whole talking point about being the entry fragger only started later on. I think initially it was just sort of somebody who happened to be that person who liked playing that role. And then I also think a part of this is, by the way, is driven by stats becoming so much more pronounced.
Sure.
I think that started in like 2009 maybe. Godfrag started earlier, but I don't think they were a big thing because they didn't have proper coverage. And then HLTV launched theirs in like 2009, 2010, and I think that's when people started paying more attention. So I think a part of it was also that once people needed sort of excuses for, hey, why are you always on the red? That's where people started coming up with all these things and like talking about them more. Not that they weren't true before that, but like that's sort of the necessity there that I think led people to talk about it. More generally or more broadly, I guess, in just thinking of roles, I think that I think it's really hard to replace players without thinking about roles. I think there's a bunch of teams historically, including some of mine, where roster changes have just like kind of happened without a lot of thought. And sometimes it's just a question of the talent pool of who's available, and sometimes it just forces some people to completely change how they're playing, and that doesn't always go well. We've seen a lot of examples of that, and I think if anything, like that's probably the best proof that roles really do matter and really do exist. And that's what you see with some of these player changes. And I think the most recent one probably is the FaZe example, because Bimas, who's playing for Mouse now, he came out and basically said, like, listen, I was just plugged into all these things because there was no time to practice, and that was just what I needed to do, and I wasn't comfortable doing any of it. But like, that's kind of what it is. And I think that used to be fairly common whenever teams didn't have a lot of time, and I think it still remains fairly common. Though today, I think it's more of a question of teams preferring to play more tournaments instead of practicing and putting in the time to sort of get used to that. Whereas today, I think they have the optionality. They just have to turn something down to do it.
Sure. I mean, I'll even give an example. I forget if actually it was one of the polls themselves who told me this, or if I noticed it in demos and then they just corroborated it. But I remember, you know, when they first added Pasha, who obviously was like a more skilled AWPer than fucking Luke was, because Luke actually was kind of like one of those AWPers where it's like, how did they get those kills? Like, they don't look that fast, they don't look that skilled, like, but they just know the game, you know, like, they're just veterans in that sense. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I remember when they like first brought in Pasha, and people forget that first year, like the first half of the year, they were just shit. Like it took them ages to get online and they were looking really bad because obviously they just left that org and they did that new project and everyone thought this is the end. And one of the things I noticed was, it's just a tiny detail, in most of the T-side tactics, like Luke would be the guy who like watched the back or something, just watched the flank. And so when he just wasn't there doing that, they obviously had never communicated. This is just something he must have just done. Well, obviously Pasha would never do that. Especially back then, he wasn't a very cerebral player. Like, I assume they were just getting reamed up the arse all the time by like some fucker like probably Ruit just pushing behind him. They're like, what, who wasn't covered that? It's like, who's supposed to be oh yeah, that guy we kicked. Yeah, like, shit, that's bad luck. And the other thing is this, right? One of the reasons, I mean, let's face it, FaZe is always going to be the ultimate example of the fact that, like, surely something like roles and role balance exists. Because they've had years now where if it was true that every smart and skilled player can play every role, they'd have figured it out by now. The fucking puzzle box would have come together. They would have made fucking, like, the Infinity Stones, basically, and just Thanos the universe, wouldn't they? Like, in theory, look at the lineups they've had over these years. Like, I even think, I'll even draw this a little bit further. Because FaZe is obviously the ultimate example, so I want to get your take on this. I have two conspiracy theories, right? One is that, because, dude, I watch these broadcasts. I'm on these broadcasts sometimes. And when we talk about FaZe, first of all, everyone regurgitates the narrative of the 2017 team of like, well, they're some of the most skilled aimers in the world. And, you know, if they get it together, they can beat anyone. It's like, what? That hasn't even been true for years now. When you talk, you know, Carrigan was kicked. He was removed as IGL in like the summer of fucking 2018 or something like, or like, you know, just going into the fall. Mm-hmm. Like that was ages ago. And it's not like they haven't had the talent since then. They've had loads of talent. It's like, if anything, their team is just Nico bashing his head against a brick wall over and over again. Like, eventually I'll get the right teammates. It's like, homie, there's never going to be right teammates for you. Like, however you're modeling the game, it doesn't exist for everyone else. So like, that's one of them that I have. And then the other one is that I don't know how this is possible, because every other great IGL, every other great player that tried being an IGL, Shox is a great example, they all eventually, Coldzera, they all eventually just go, yeah, it isn't for me, actually, I'm going to go back. Nico just never does that second part. He must be like the slowest learner ever. I don't get it, because he's such a brilliant player. Like, my joke basically is, the only IGL that can always shut down Nico the star player is fucking Nico the IGL. That's like the fucking witty way of saying it. You know? So what do you think on some of this? Because obviously FaZe is the best like extreme example to use.
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent, that I think we've seen this throughout Carrigan's career to some extent. Is like, whenever he joins a team, like, he clearly brings a bunch of structure with him. That,
there's a guy that knows roles.
He always makes the teams better, at least initially. They usually also tend to peak relatively soon after he joins. If you look at all the teams that he's played, whether it's like the previous Astralis team is TSM at the time, or then FaZe, and then now Mouse. But they always tend to run into issues for a reason or another later on. But he always makes them better initially, and I think a big part of that is just like giving structure. And part of the reason why they tend to do well even after he's usually been getting removed is that I think they retain a bunch of that structure, but then they just replace him with a better player at that point. The only problem is, like, at some point the structure slowly disappears. There's nobody nagging players in practice to do the right thing here and there, and then like people just get caught into bad habits. So I fully buy into that. I think FaZe has had a bunch of really incredible rosters during the Carrigan era, also after Carrigan. I don't really know how they think about team building, to be honest. Like, I would have thought that they should, like, if I were Nico, I probably would have just wanted to pick up anybody who wants to call at all. Like, whether it's like Golden, just get like somebody who's just like willing to do that. Just to like take it off your plate, and like you can give him guidance. Like, the reason all these really good players want to call at some point, like whether it's Shox or Cold or Nico, whoever, is that if you're a smart player, you can always have one or two good reads in a half. Like when you get to pick your spots, that's the difference. The annoying and hard part about being a caller is that whether you have an idea or whether you want to call something that round, you always have to have something. There can't be a round where it starts and you have no view as to what to do. That doesn't work. It's a lot easier if you're just sort of there in a secondary capacity, and then a couple times a half you notice something, you have a read, and if you're always right the times that you speak up, obviously you feel like, hey, like this actually seems like I would be better than somebody, because every time I speak, we win. It's like an adverse selection problem though, because you only speak up when you have your best ideas, and everybody else is forced to speak regardless of how comfortable they feel about it. And I think that's why people constantly trick themselves into doing it. But that's it, by the way. I wasn't a caller when I started playing either. I started calling because I thought that I could do a better job, and we ended up doing better. So I guess in my part, it at least worked out back then.
Here's the thing. Even as you were saying that and hearing yourself saying it, it must have hit home a little bit when you were saying, like, just because they kick the in-game leader and put in a more skilled player doesn't mean, they just retain a lot of the structure. Because if people don't know, in 2008, Lurpus's team, after this is how bad these guys were, after cutting everyone else in the team selectively and also bringing them back like 3 months later or whatever, they just eventually realized, like, it's like anyone, like, maybe we should just cut Lurpus as well, even though he was literally the in-game leader doing everything, right? And the best part is, when they cut him and brought back, I think it was T-Hop they brought back, the AWPer, right? When they got T-Hop back, who obviously was a more overall skilled player, but knew fuck all about tactics, by the way. All they did, and the reason we know this, by the way, is because we have an inside man. Lurpus's brother still played on the team. All they did was just keep all of Lurpus's tactics, all his structure, and just basically, if they fragged out, because they had like 5 really good players, they could do like some of the best results. They could come like 3rd or sometimes 2nd or 4th or something. And they could get all these big wins, but they could never evolve beyond that point because they were just trapped in like a prison that you'd created for them. And then obviously that just over time just became more and more outdated. And then I assume they just thought they were missing their shots as well. You can talk to this. Come on. It was ridiculous, wasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it goes a little bit deeper than that, because I think if you knew the whole story of how some of those roster changes were made at 3 a.m. after losses at tournaments, like you wouldn't believe it how some of those things went down. But I mean so they played without me for like 3 months, I think, maybe 4 months, and then I played with I put together a pug with Natu and played them at a WCG qualifier, and we came within like a round of beating them because we just read them every round, even though we had like really bad players on our team. And then like next week, Conte messaged me and like, hey, you wanna join the team back? Like they basically had just like lost all the routine, weren't practicing, didn't know how to run anything anymore. And I honestly think the biggest thing is just like not having anybody nagging on you, like you get into bad habits. But it's nicer when it doesn't happen. Nobody likes to listen to somebody else complain. It's not enjoyable.
Because the other thing, I forgot the other conspiracy theory. Right, here's the other conspiracy theory, and this one is barely even a conspiracy theory. That is just real, which is, the reason why I brought up the thing that where they bring up the old FaZe narrative is the reason they do it, Lurpus, is because it's awkward to say when you listen. If you're an analyst, obviously you respect Nico's game. He's a fucking amazing individual player. Like, he's going to go down as one of the best players ever. So you don't want to be going on desks doing what I do, basically, which is like, the guy seems like something of an egotist. He's very stubborn and he's sort of fucking up his own career, because that's not a cool storyline. Who the fuck wants to hear that? Like, you want to believe that it's going to work out, and that because he's smart individually, that's going to apply to the team. So as a result, I've noticed analysts do their absolute best not to criticize FaZe too hard. They just sort of make it like, just give him time, or like, it's a new player. It's like, mate, how many new players have they fucking had?
The funny thing that nobody ever catches on to, by the way, this is super obvious, but like people just like won't have the view, is that the easiest way to be well liked and popular is to only say nice things about everybody. People always say that like you do it or I used to do it to be like
for attention or whatever. Yeah,
like that's actually the easiest way to be disliked, and not like people to not want you to be around. But like, what's the fucking point? What's the point of just like repeating the same thing everybody else does or everybody else says? But that actually is the easiest way.
And here's the problem, right? It's bad enough they've got all the players we fucking love. Like, even when they had Guardian and Olaf, like, I love those guys. What, you think I don't like Cold Zera, Rain? But here's the problem. It's bad enough they've got all the fan favourites. Then they've got Yanko, our literal friend who we used to all work with in a really pulling for. So I think the problem is people know if I go too hard on FaZe, because obviously when you watch FaZe, you're just like, what are you doing in these practice games, boys? Like, it's been years now. Where are the tactics? Like, the problem is that is sort of Yanko's job. So I'm like, awkward, like, so you just don't want to say anything. So as a result, though, we've now created a monster dude, because I think, no joke, like, it's become like, it's like a self-reinforcing scenario, because no one criticizes them and they believe it all works, and it's all like, the next guy is the right one. Like, they're just trapped in purgatory. They just keep going through the same cycle over and over, because I've said this a million times. Think of all the versions of FaZe. There's not a single one that actually ever did have everyone frag out. In fact, and this is, listen, I'm going to sound like I blow my own horn here. If you look at the most successful versions of FaZe, they just also break down into like Mars standard model of how you make a team, basically. You have a couple of them who are like frag out all the time. You have one who does it when he can, it's the right map and he has the right spots, you know. You have the guy, Olaf Meister in this case, forced to play supportive. Rain somewhat forced to do that. And then whoever the IGL is, it depends how good they are. Sometimes they're just an IGL. They're just there to not die and do a call around or something. So like, I don't know why people think that's the example. Because you know the problem is, the downside is FaZe mixed with the fact that FPL's the new way you get into pro player has sort of convinced a generation of players that despite what Astralis has done, they look at FaZe and they're like, that's the team I'm going to be in. I'm going to just frag out and we're all going to have a great time and I'll just learn the game as I go. And so I feel like they might have actually warped like a whole generation of young players, unfortunately, because I don't see where the next like great supports is. Where are those guys, you know?
Well, part of the problem also is that like the way players come up now is almost always they get picked up by some international team, and like that's where they take the leap. Like it's pretty rare for there to be like just the nice perfect fit for you to do that domestically. Like for example, Zywo did. A lot of the time it is a team like Mouse or FaZe or somebody else who has an international roster speaking English that's willing to take a shot on some of these guys. And when it happens that way, you don't organically just build a team. When you build a team out of nothing, a lot of the time it is, you know, from one country, it's people you know, etc. And that's where you sort of build more of a team-ish team, if you will. So, you know, where you think about the roles and you don't have such a big talent pool to pick out from. So some of the players just sort of naturally end up being support players, role players, etc. But when it's all built through, like you said, through FPL and through these international rosters, it's just a lot easier to pick the guy who looks like they have the highest ceiling. Never mind whether they're actually going to be able to get to that level in a team environment. I mean, like we've seen some of these examples. Obviously, I think like Rups is probably the best example of someone who really did do well.
Sure.
Where he went to an international team and just came out of FPL, didn't have any experience, but turned out to be like a very good complete player. It's obvious he's just like a smart player. You know, he's just not there because he happens to have really good hand-eye coordination if you watch him play. Then there's a lot of these other players who like, you know, they just like not look the same in a team environment. You think about Frozen, like, you know, when people were talking about him before he joined Mouse, like what he could do as part of like a bad team against good teams, looked amazing.
Yes.
Looked like one of those guys who could conceivably be like one of the next Nikos, because remember, that's how Nico was. Nico was an amazing player in a bad team, and he was just like racking up insane numbers, but he was always in losses and against like semi-good to very good teams, but never in the biggest matches. And I think it's just it's a hard adjustment, and like coming up that way, it's hard to come up if you're the fourth best player individually on a team, because you're just not going to be the guy who gets picked up unless you work your way through lower levels, sort of how I suppose like Babsky has now gotten onto Astralis from. Like, you know, he wasn't one of the star players, even in Tricked when they got picked up by Mad Lions.
Yeah.